Welcome to this screencast of the Suez Crisis in 1956. As you can see on this opening slide here, the From Russia with Love film is just to indicate that this is just one part of my Cold War series and in my series of IB revision materials. This will hopefully be a 10-minute overview, therefore obviously it won't be going into all of the detail required to get a full understanding of the crisis, but it will give you an overview of the crisis. And down there you can see just a picture of the Suez Canal. On the screen here you just see an overview of the different areas that are covered in terms of the content areas we'll be looking at. And here you can just see troops moving across the Suez Canal. This is an Egyptian tank as it moves across the canal in the time of the crisis in Suez. Looking back a little bit before we go forward, and in terms of strategic influence of the Suez Canal, it's important to understand why it was created. It was actually first initiated by France, and then Britain jumped on board, purely really because of its influence in terms of strategic importance as a travel route. Britain, as an empire, relied on trade around the world and getting products to and from places around the world. So most of the time, Britain would have to travel around the Cape of Good Hope on the southern tip of South Africa, and that was not only long, but it's also a dangerous route. So they were very keen to have a safer route to transport goods, particularly through to India and Australia and those southern parts of Eastern Africa. So the obvious place was if you go through the Mediterranean and the Gibraltar Straits and you go into the waterway there, just in between, well, as part of Egypt really and near what became Israel, is a small area of land which was turned into the canal, called the Suez Canal. And we'll see closer up pictures, but it really stemmed from a need for trade routes for the empire, particularly Britain and France. The point of this lesson is to not only describe the main causes of the crisis, but also to really importantly to understand how far this crisis was responsible for that increasing tension in the Cold War between East and West, or particularly USA and the USSR. You can see here is kind of an aerial view of the Suez Crisis. Its length, its place in the middle of kind of Egyptian territory there, but it really was just to join up that landlocked area, to open up the trade routes. And you can see here a different view of that. You can just, if you look up from the Red Sea there, moving up to the Mediterranean Sea, up at Port Said, if you capture that part of land, you can just see there is a small waterway seen as a Suez Canal. It's an artificial canal in Egypt, 101 miles long. It has since been talked about extending that to make it larger. It links the Mediterranean Sea with the Red Sea, as you can see. It was built, before it was built, the goods were often carried over land between the two seas. So realistically, to transport any mass goods with any speed, it was important to open up a waterway that was able to carry these goods. And so a canal was deemed that it was going to be built in this area. The creation of the canal in 1854, Ferdinand de Lesseps, as a French former diplomat, persuaded the Viceroy of Egypt, Mohammed Said, to permit the construction of a shipping canal through that 100 miles of desert between Africa and Asia. Britain, naturally suspicious of France, boycotted the canal, and Egypt therefore acquired 40% of the shares. Egypt, if you need to be clear, is a British possession at this time. In the first year of the canal's existence, some 3/4 of the vessels using it were in fact British. So Britain were really making use of it. The British Empire was really making use of this canal. And by the mid-1870s, Egypt had incurred huge debts. The British Prime Minister at the time, Benjamin Disraeli, bought Egypt's shareholding for £4 million and established Britain's influence in the running of this incredibly important waterway. It's important to stop at this point and just understand just how important this was. This kind of waterway that linked up Europe to the rest of the Eastern world, and then with the kind of the influence of oil in that region, this canal became more and more important. And really, started to gain the interest of the rest of the world. Just looking at this diagram here, you can see what I'm talking about in terms of the trade routes and the links. And obviously with oil, it became hugely important. Just another image here, just to see the vast size and scale of the canal. It's not a small waterway, it's a large, this is the aircraft carrier, and they are significantly large. So it was designed to be able to carry huge amounts of not only kind of military vessels, but trade vessels. And here you can see the entrance to the canal in Port Said. Fun fact was the Statue of Liberty was actually designed as meant to be starting off at Port Said as a welcome to the Suez Canal. But after the French had lost, shall we say, favor with the region, it was given over to America. And as we know now, it stands as the entrance to New York. But it was actually originally designed to be as the entrance to the Suez Canal. Again, here you can just see just another image here of the region. And the reason for this is just to start understanding why the rest of the world started to get involved. As you can see here, Israel is a new state after the Second World War, placed in there by the West, who, particularly the USA, who wanted a land to a home for the Jewish population, and Israel was designated as that status. So Israel is there nestled up against as Egypt, and in the middle of Egypt you see the Suez Canal and the Gulf of Suez there. So most of this land is Egyptian. France and Britain have paid and bought for this canal sitting in the middle of it, which is all good, all well and good, so long as European rulers have control over Egypt. If that's to change, then we have problems, and those problems could be significant. And you can see here just where Israel sits again, a bit more clearly here. You can see that the land is Egypt and the Sinai Desert. Going back a little bit, in Egypt, King Farouk I had been ruling over Egypt from 1936 to 52. You can see in these pictures here, he's pictured with Arab friends, but although he really was friendlier with European leaders, got a lot of benefits from Europe, a lot of money, and it was certainly in his interest to stay friendly. The Egyptian military had been increasingly angry at being defeated by Israel in the Arab-Israeli conflict and sought revenge. So Israel, this new state, in this Arab-Israeli war, they had actually defeated the Egyptian military. And in response to that, Egypt closed the Suez Canal to Israeli ships in 1949 and continued to try to strangle Israeli trade this way. They also supported the Arab Palestinians in the Gaza Strip and enabled them to launch attacks into Israel. So really, Egypt and Israel are forming there's a hostile environment between the two. And if you think about the Egyptian support by Europe, Israel is supported in part by America. There's certainly American influence there. And Russia is not shy in also supporting the Arab Palestinians. So it's starting to heat up in terms of an international potential conflict zone. In 1952, army officers called the Free Officers Movement in Egypt overthrew King Farouk and put Jamal Nasser into power. And you can see the picture of him in here. Now, it's important to note that Jamal Nasser was not necessarily ideologically driven by communism or anything like that, but he was certainly looking out for the best interests of an independent Egypt. So he was really looking at anything that would benefit him. And the non-aligned movement was certainly something that he was really pushing. If we look around the world at the time, Korea had just proved that Europe was no longer taking precedence in international affairs, and really it wasn't Britain or France or Spain anymore. It was the USA and USSR. They were the two dominating entities. And the Middle East was actually becoming an area of real interest. Israel had become a state. Oil was becoming something to consider. NATO had been created as a movement to defend against Russia. And then the Warsaw Pact had been designed as really a foil to that. And in the face of this kind of bipolar paradigm, these two entities of NATO and the Warsaw Pact, which was really dominating the world, Africa and Asia really wanted to become more independent from the USA and USSR. So this is where the non-aligned movement came from. So we'd have NATO, the Warsaw Pact, and NAM, or the non-aligned movement. So the aims of it was to resist colonialism and imperialism in all forms, so really attacking the ideals of Europe and Britain. And they wanted to promote Afro-Asian cooperation, so get a stable kind of group of countries in that region to act as a real power base and make it three instead of two. Um, he primarily, Jamal Nasser really primarily became the leader of this non-aligned movement. He also became what was called as the father of Arab nationalism, and his pledge was that all Arab countries could be united to some degree by a common language and heritage under pan-Arabism. So why did Nasser, come into conflict with the West, considering the European kind of ownership of that region? So first of all, Egypt had supported the Algerian independence movements. So France were upset by that because France had owned Algeria as one of their colonies. With the UK, Egypt quite clearly wanted to get rid of Britain from the Suez Canal, and that would have upset England. And with the USA, Nasser was willing to support anybody, really, to accept support from anyone, and in particular the Soviet support. And he refused to recognize Israel. So in these three movements, he's really aligning himself against France, UK, and USA, and is maybe moving towards anyone who will support him. In this case, the Soviets aren't showing coming forward. And the Suez Crisis really starts to take on shape with the Aswan Dam. As you can see, Aswan is nowhere really near Suez. It's miles away. In fact, it's down in the south. But it's certainly something of interest to the USA and the UK. Why? Well, owning the ability to power a country is beneficial. Having influence in the region is beneficial. The power and the economic value of this is certainly going to be useful, but really it's also to gain favor of Egypt because the Suez Canal is so important. So having interest and power in this region, particularly with the developing state of oil, is hugely important for these two countries. So what happens in December 1955? USA and Britain pledged $56 and $14 million respectively towards the construction of a dam. So $70 million is pledged. In May 1956, Nasser recognizes communist China. Now this is where it starts to irritate the USA. It's in direct conflict with Dulles' policy of containment. Well, Truman's policy of containment followed by Eisenhower, and Dulles is his right-hand man, really working with the CIA. This annoys them, and then to follow suit, the Soviets offer Nasser just over $1 billion for the construction of the dam, eclipsing anything the US did. The US State Department, in response to this, announces all withdrawal of financial support for the dam. This and his support of China irritates USA. Now, Britain is furious at this because Britain really wants USA to be involved in there to avoid any Soviet influence so they can keep control over the dam. And the big kicker here is Nasser nationalizes the Suez Canal, which starts the Suez Crisis. He nationalized something, just to remind a few out there, it's basically the government takes control of what was private industry or a private region or a private, in this case, waterway. Now, the interesting thing is that this waterway belonged to Britain and France, and Nasser in one foul swoop just takes it. Britain and France are absolutely furious and claim all sorts of horrors that this has been an act of war, etc., etc. You'll remember in the future, Castro does the same thing with America in Cuba, but in this case, it's irritating. In the future, the USSR eventually steps in and funds the dam project completely. As you can see, Britain and France are outraged by this, and they demand that Nasser returns the canal to them. He refuses, and effectively the scene is set for war. However, Britain and France can't openly wage war. Who could attack them? Potentially Russia. No one wants to see that. And actually, though, the region is potentially unstable. And Britain is no longer the power it once was, nor is France. So for them to attack, the UN might get involved. There's a whole bunch of people. It's a very complex area. So they plan something different. The plan was Israel would attack Egypt, and this would prompt Britain and France to step in and separate the warring countries, and when it was all said and done, they would take the canal back to their control. You can see here Israel would sweep across the Sinai Peninsula, come up to the canal. Britain and France would then jump in and kick Israel out. Israel, for their work, would get more of Egypt and the Sinai Peninsula, and Britain and France get the canal back. So the actual plan, so France approaches Israel for military assistance against the Egyptians. Britain and France would capture the canal, and Israel would sweep across the Sinai Peninsula, pushing Arab people further back to their borders. Israel was desperately eager to demonstrate her independence at this point, and the might to all her enemies. So, was it a good plan? Well, I don't know. Maybe in theory it was, but the actuality of it was that Israel was seen to invade. Britain and France did indeed get involved, but then the USA and Russia were kind of there, so they had to do something, and this is where it becomes a little awkward in terms of what happens next. To add to the mix and to really increase the tension in the region, um, Britain and France do launch attacks on Egypt. Nasser appeals to the Soviet leader Khrushchev, who threatens in only the way he can to shower the West with nuclear weapons if the British and French didn't withdraw. Now, this is a particularly scary threat, considering in Korea there had been dummy atomic bombs being dropped all over the place, that America had, under Truman, dropped nuclear weapons on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and Russia had demonstrated the ability for nuclear weapons. So this isn't an absent threat, it's a potential threat. I don't know how serious anyone would have taken it, but it's certainly not to be taken lightly. So the points of view of the crisis of each country, and it's important to have a look at what each country was doing, interested in. You can see here in Egypt, Nasser he asserted himself, wanted independence from Britain, wanted self-determination. He was funding insurgents in other countries, and he was upsetting Israel. Israel had been involved in civil war and independence in 1949, surrounded by enemies, still is today, supported by the USA, had an advanced military. They wanted to protect, or their dream was to protect themselves from a future Holocaust, and they were keen to punish Egypt for giving Palestinian guerrillas a base. When we look at the USA and USSR, this is the kind of things that they wanted. USA wanted influence in the Middle East to contain communism, which was Truman's policy and remained a policy of presence ongoing. They wanted to promote capitalism and democracy. They wanted to protect the natural resources, oil and shipping lines. Now you can read that differently. Protect, get benefit from oil and shipping lines. That mean the same thing. They'd already pledged $70 million with Britain to build the Aswan Dam. Obviously that fell through and they pulled that back. And really why? Because they wanted the land and the electric power that would come with it, but also influence in the region. Russia wanted influence in the Middle East. They wanted to promote communism, prevent capitalism. That's the typical Cold War story. They wanted to assist where they could any post-colonial states. And then we look at France and Great Britain and what they wanted. France wanted to protect its North African empire, Algeria, Morocco, Tunisia. It ended up giving away Morocco and Tunisia and losing Algeria. It wanted to re-establish dominance in international relations to get its power base. It's never going to happen. And it wanted to punish Nasser for the support in Algeria. From Great Britain's perspective, Great Britain wanted control of Suez Canal, had 74 years of it. It was very, very financially beneficial to them. Prime Minister Anthony Eden actually viewed Nasser as the Hitler of the Middle East. Anthony Eden lost his position after this war and was very upset with the States for a short period of time. And obviously they wanted to overthrow Nasser. Just some pictures. We just go back slightly here of the conflict. So you can see them tanks. You can see some Marines climbing up the side of the canal there, the blockade of the canal, some paratroopers landing in. So you can see here, though, so Israel does expand at the Egyptians' expense right up to the Suez Canal. So what happens? Well, actually the United Nations is called in by the USA to stop the war, and this is where Canada and Lester B. Pearson come in, who are credited with negotiation of the peace effort. The USA is finding itself in a position where it's unable to support Britain and France because it would be seen as aggressor, and it would be directly opposed to the Soviet Union. And actually the Soviet Union, with the United States, they support the United Nations, and it was allowed to act. The USA had another thing to be thinking about this time in Hungary. The Hungarian uprising had just taken place, and they were watching the Soviet advance into Hungary. The USA couldn't take a moral defense of Hungary, which it was doing, but then at the same hand waltz into Suez and help its allies in Egypt. So it was very mindful of its influence in Hungary and what was being said down, and it didn't want to do the same. So this really shows a starting point of Cold War brinkmanship, which was taking precedence over the Middle East. It is the whatever USA and USSR, Soviet Union were doing at the time, was really controlling the region. The USA put financial pressure on Britain to quit the region. And Saudi Arabia, meanwhile, cut back Britain's oil supply. So Britain was being strangled. Britain was furious at this point. It was trying to cling on to its place in the world, and it was being pushed out by those who were considered to be its friends in the USA. In fact, Anthony Eden was very angry at the Americans for this. The relationship deteriorated between the two countries, but under Macmillan started to improve again, so it wasn't long lasting. And this crisis, which was fairly short-lived, it does end. Britain, France, and Israel all withdrew from the canal, and Israel had to give back the Gaza Strip to Egyptian control, so things really returned. The United Nations put a peacekeeping force in to cover the Sinai Peninsula and to keep the enemies apart. It had been a diplomatic victory for Egypt for sure, but it was humiliation for Israel, Britain, and France. And we can't understate how humiliating it was. It showed the world that the real power now lay with the superpowers of the USA and communist USSR. No one could act without their approval in the world. In terms of, and that's it, that's where the crisis ends. I mean, really, I would say it was the last fling of the British imperialism. At this point, the whole idea of colonization, Britain started to pull away from its empire. And Suez really was the kind of like the death point of British imperialism, I would argue. But really, in terms of the tension of the Cold War, does it increase the tension? It brings those countries, the USSR and USA, closer together. It brings the West and the East, with Britain and France, and the Eastern nations of Russia, closer together. And certainly, the potential for crisis was there. But really, in this case, the USA and USSR acted together to try and avert a crisis, but to gain more of their own interest in the world. So did it build the tension between the two countries? I would argue that not as much as Korea, and certainly not as much as when we start seeing things in Hungary and even more drastically the Cuban Missile Crisis. But it's just another reminder that these two countries have such power and influence in the world. And in that respect, there is certainly an issue. I hope that was useful. As I said, this is just a very brief overview and gives a sense of this crisis. Certainly go into more research to look at some of these issues in more depth because they do require that. But I hope this gives you a sense of this conflict. Thank you for listening.